Welcome, everyone. My name is Stuart Duncan. I'm the Director of Fellowships, Outreach and Programming for the Graduate School. I see many of our attendees have been to some of our previous events for this summer series postdoc session. Today's session is on grant writing. I'm really excited that we've got some illustrious guests with us today to be able to share some of their experiences. Before we get started, I do want you to know that live captioning is available. I am putting this in the chat with a link so that if you wish to view the stream with live captioning, it is available. And I encourage you to click on the link to be able to go there. If you have any problems, obviously email ucis@uconn.edu. Again, my name is Stuart Duncan. My pronouns are he, him. And you're going to be able to interact with our panelists during our live Q&A session. But I want to talk a little bit about how the session is going to work. There are three components today. First, our panelists will introduce themselves and provide an overview of the types of grants they've worked on. Second section, our panelists will respond to 8 questions regarding different aspects of grant writing. And then finally, we're going to finish up today with live questions from you. So while you're listening to the panelists talking about their experiences with grant writing, you might want to pop down some questions that you can ask later. So you might ask now, how will you ask questions? Well, you can do that by sending me a chat saying you would like to be able to ask the questions live, and that will mean you'll be able to be, like us, a panelist, and your video will be active and it allows more dialogue, so you can do it that way. You can also write the question in the chat box and I'll read out the question for you. To do that, you just need to make it to host and then write that in the chat box. If you're viewing the live caption version, you can also email me at stuart.duncan@uconn.edu. I'm going to write that in here so you can all see that. You can send me that email, and if with any tech issues you get as well, you also can feel free to send me those. But without further ado, I want to just briefly introduce our 4 panelists today. So if you'd like to unmute your videos, folks, so that folks can see your lovely shiny faces. We have Morgan Donaldson, Director of Educational Policy Analysis and Associate Professor in the NEAG School of Education, joining us. We have Amy Gorin, Director of InChip and Professor of Psychological Sciences. We have Leslie Shaw, the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Education and Associate Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering. And then we also have Michael Willig, Executive Director for the Institute of Environment and Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So thank you very much to you for joining us today for this event. And I'd like to first start by handing over the reins to Morgan to talk to us a little bit about her experience with grants.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, so if you could pull up my slides, that would be great. I'm just waiting for those to come up. Or should I just start, Stuart?
I think you should be able to see them on the screen now. You should be able to see them on there.
I can't.
Okay.
Maybe it's just me, but.
I do believe we are able to see.
Okay.
So the folks are on the call can
okay, good. All right, that's what matters. So again, my name's Morgan Donaldson, and my area of focus is education research, and with a particular focus on educational leadership and educational policies. And I'm very, very interested and have done the bulk of my research related to educator effectiveness. So teacher effectiveness, principal effectiveness, and a variety of policies and practices aimed at increasing their effectiveness. And in particular, a number of my grants have looked at teacher and principal evaluation and development, also human capital policies in school districts, such as hiring, there we go, educator hiring, educator evaluation, educator professional development and learning opportunities. And then lastly, I've done research on school organization and how that relates to student achievement. I've held a number of different grants, and they range in size from about $20,000 for a small grant up to $4 million for grants from the National Science Foundation. So a whole range of different grants. And if you looked at my CV, you would see that I started off small. So I tended to have small grants as an assistant professor, and my grants have steadily gotten larger as I've moved on through tenure and promotion. So in terms of the types of grants I've received, so if you move forward there, Stuart, yeah. There we go. So they're the sizes. Yep. There we go. So the types of grants I've received from the federal government, I've received grants from the Institute of Education Sciences. So that is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. So I've received grants from that agency, and then also from the U.S. Department of Education itself. So it runs some grants through itself, and some grants it delegates to IES. And also I've received grants from the National Science Foundation. At the state level, I've received grants from the General Assembly. And then at the foundation level, I've received a variety of different grants from the Spencer Foundation, which is probably the largest grant maker in the area of education. Also from the Nellie Mae Foundation, which is a regional foundation, New England, largely New England based. And then I did some work for a court case in Connecticut. So I received some funding from the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education. So that doesn't list all of them, but it gives you an idea of the range of different sources of grants I've received and kind of their orientations, and federal, state, local foundations, as well as national foundations. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Moving on now to Amy.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Amy Gorin. I am a professor of psychological sciences, and I am the director of the Institute for Collaboration on Health Intervention and Policy, which is one of the larger research institutes on campus. Actually, it cuts across the campuses. We work with faculty from all different schools and units, departments, and folks at UConn Health and our various other campuses as well. So my own personal research focuses on weight management, and I'm a clinical health psychologist, and so I like to develop interventions and test them out in the real world. And I've done that in a number of different contexts. So we do both in-person weight management programs as well as online weight management programs. A lot of our work focuses on the maintenance piece because it's really easy to get people to lose weight initially, but the difficulty is in keeping the weight off long-term and making healthy behavior choices, for a lifestyle. And so we looked at that in couples. We've worked with very young families, young children, and everything sort of in between. So my own grant writing, I first got an external grant when I was doing my dissertation. It was a smaller grant from a Society of Clinical Psychology that gave me enough to run my treatment study that I did in graduate school. And then from there, like Morgan, just progressively have increased in size and scope of grant writing and grant opportunities. So I had to look in preparation for today, but just to give you a sense, right now, currently, I'm a PI on an R21, which is a smaller grant mechanism through NIH, more for some pilot studies that hopefully will lead into larger grants. I am co-I on 2 large NIH grants right now. I co-direct the Weight Management Research Laboratory out in Hartford, and I'm co-I with the co-director. And I would say, as a tip, that's something that's worked very well for me over time, is developing really strong collaborations that I've maintained for several years. So Tricia Leahy and I work very closely together, and we have 2 large-scale projects right now. I'm a co-investigator on 2 smaller-scale NIH projects, one with someone from UConn Health and one with someone from URI. And I'm a consultant on 2 other large-scale trials through NIH. And I've been funded from NIH since 2001 continuously, which is something that is fun to reflect on, but also reflects a fair amount of work and a fair amount of luck. Obesity was a topic that was just gaining steam as I was coming out of graduate school. So I sort of timed it well with a topic that a lot of money was being invested into at the time, and that's allowed me to grow in that area. So I'm always happy to chat with folks about grant writing. We do have a lot of grant writing support through our institute, and I would never have been successful at it without a really strong mentor when I was a postdoc. Sort of worked in a grant factory to some extent and learned the tools of the trade there. And that's been incredibly helpful to me. And I know that not everybody has that kind of mentoring relationship. And so I'm always willing to help if you reach out. No, I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. Leslie.
Great. Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Leslie Shore. I'm an associate professor in chemical and biomolecular engineering, and also now associate dean for research and graduate education in the School of Engineering. I've got kind of a strange background, started out in the sciences, went on into engineering. I've basically done work or have a degree in everything from environmental science engineering, chemical science engineering, and also biological biotechnology stuff as well. So kind of a really broad background. And I think that's actually one reason that I've been able to be successful with grant writing is because I can see diverse connections. And so when I speak with postdocs and people that are starting out, one of the pieces of advice I give is to try to hook up two kind of different, but not too different areas of expertise that kind of makes you a unique, the intersection of those two different trainings makes you a bit unique, because in the end of the day, you've got to be the best in the world at the tiny little thing you do. And one way to do that is to overlap two areas that maybe nobody else has that particular overlap. And so in my case, that's sort of a environmental science and microfluidics training that was kind of unique just when I was coming up. And so I kind of made a little bit of my own niche in that particular area, pun intended. So I, as I mentioned briefly, work in the area of microbial function, environmental biotechnology. And I've been able to go after a wide range of different types of grants because of that interdisciplinary breadth I bring. About half of them have been NSF, but also USDA and DOE, a smattering of Department of Defense, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also industry. So I think one of the really strong strategies is to form a good collaboration with others. You want to be able to go for diverse grants, but at the same time, you can't be all things to all people. So it's all about collaboration. And there, I think the way to collaborate effectively is through generosity with your collaborators. I think credit is like love. The more you share it, the more there is in the world. And so that's always been something I've embraced. And I think that's helped me to establish lasting collaborations with others. And like Amy as well, I would never have been anywhere if it weren't for mentors and advisors. So if there's anyone out there in WebEx land that's kind of anywhere from chemistry, biological sciences, environmental science, through any field of engineering, please feel free to reach out anytime, and I'll be happy to either help you directly or try to connect you with those who can. So that's what I had for intro. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you, Leslie. Michael, would you like me to share your PowerPoint here?
Yes, please do. Well, my name is Mike Wollig. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of the Environment, as well as a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. My disciplinary background is in ecology, biodiversity science, and conservation biology. And I have an emerging focus on resistance, resilience, and vulnerability of coupled human and natural systems. I've really been fortunate, like all the other three presenters today, to benefit from colleagues and collaborators who've assisted me in sort of all facets of grant writing, whether it's a large multidisciplinary project or even in terms of single investigator projects where their good counsel and advice has helped me to become successful in the long term. Next slide, please. So I have a suite of just examples of grants that I'm currently or recently was a member of to give you an idea, I guess, of the variety of kinds of proposals and kinds of projects that I've worked on. So I'm currently the PI on a single investigator award that has as its purpose the synthesis of a long career of research. In my case, it's over 30 years of research, and it focuses on disturbance ecology of animals in tropical ecosystems in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. And I've also participated in sort of moderate-sized team science that's transdisciplinary in nature. In this particular case, it was the Knowledge Network and Distributed Intelligence Program, and it was a collaboration between ecologists and conservation biologists on the one hand, with computer scientists and bioinformaticists to develop a management tool for identifying distributed and heterogeneous data that can be marshaled to address compelling questions in biodiversity science. Next slide, please. Also with support from NSF, and like Amy, it's actually for the last 31 years, I've been supported by the National Science Foundation's Long-Term Ecological Research Project, where we work on understanding ecosystem change in northeastern Puerto Rico. This project is particularly complex. It involves 10 institutions, about 30 investigators. I started out as a senior personnel on the originating proposal, and I'm currently, and have for the last 12 years or so, been a co-PI on the project. And the collaborations involve atmospheric scientists, geoscientists, as well as plant, animal, and microbial biologists. Next slide, please. And also, I think when sort of developing a portfolio of proposals or grants, it's important to think of ways that you can integrate well, it's always important to integrate your research and education together, but there are some opportunities for education-focused opportunities. So we've just received notice from NSF that a project on which I'm one of 10 core scientists, we've been supported from the research traineeship program to build a graduate program that addresses strategic decision-making to assess risk and trade-offs between managing landscapes for food, energy, water, and biodiversity. Next slide, please. And finally, like all the other presenters, I've been supported by a variety of grants from federal, state, and NGOs. And these are just some examples of other kinds of opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of. So I think that the key note that I would make is that I think it's always good to be prepared for that serendipity that happens, whether it's working with a colleague or seeing a new grant opportunity and taking advantage of it while you can. Thank you.
Thank you to our 4 panelists for their introductions. And just so panelists know, we currently have about 24 postdocs, and I know a few of their names have come up several times and have been in several of the sessions. So I know that we've got a broad array of folks all the way across from social sciences, hard sciences to humanities here as well. So we have a broad swathe of postdocs with us today. And so we're going to move to the next section of our presentation today. And that's several questions that were framed prior to this meeting that we wanted to pose to the panelists. And so they've had a chance to think about 4 of these questions, and 4 of them they have not had a chance to think about. So they'll be doing a little bit of work on the fly with that. And then while they're responding to this, please take down any questions you have. And what I'm going to propose we do, because we've had a few tech issues with the new update to WebEx over the weekend, I'm going to suggest you send those questions to me via chat or via my email address, which you can see in the chat logs. That way I can then ask them those questions when it comes to the Q&A, rather than trying to get your video working and bounce that in here. So again, if you can post your questions through the chat to me, then I can keep a log of those for when we get to that section. But to the questions that we have for this section. So to the panelists, what tips do you have for postdocs who are writing their first grant application? What's your do's and don'ts? I'm going for that, Michael.
I think one is start early. I think all scientists procrastinate a bit, and there's nothing like a deadline to motivate us, but it's closer than you think. Start early. Make sure you leave yourself time to get friendly review, both from sort of critical scientists in the field, but also friends who can evaluate exposition as much as content. And I guess the final thing I would, well, 2 other things. One is a lot of agencies provide abstracts of funded proposals. I think it's good to look over the kinds of summaries that you have of those proposals. And if some of them are close to your areas, write to the PI, ask to see their proposal. Many of them will more than graciously show you their proposal, actually show you previous reviews of proposals along with critiques. And I think one unfortunate thing about the current scenario is that we have to get used to rejection. We're rejected more often than we're funded. Hopefully you become more funded as time goes on, but rejection is the norm rather than the exception. Don't be discouraged.
I would I would add to that, don't wait till it's perfect to get feedback. So there's often a hesitation to share work because you're concerned about the response it's going to get. But grant writing really is an iterative process where, you know, you go in one direction, you get feedback, you change course, you might even come back to the original direction, but just, you know, don't sit on it and hold until you feel like it's perfect. And then the other thing is just the mindset when you're writing a grant. At least for me, reminding yourself that you're writing a sales pitch for people who may or may not know your area very well. You know, it's a little discouraging, I think, to realize who reviews your grants. And it's not always someone who has your level of expertise in your area, which it should be ideally, but you know, these are big panels sometimes. And so you really need to write it in a convincing and easy to understand way for someone who, you know, has some knowledge of your field, but maybe isn't in the weeds as you are. So put on your sales pitch hat.
I think I'll add to that I think that it's always important to write very directly and to emphasize the contribution of your research. So it can be helpful to have someone who's outside of your particular expertise, but near enough to sort of mimic what a potential reviewer would pick out as weaknesses. It's helpful to have someone like that read a draft and give you suggestions and comments, because you're likely so focused on your research that you can forget that you have to make the case that it matters and that it's a contribution. The other thing I would add is I think sometimes in all of our fields, we get encouraged to go after these mega grants, these, you know, federal grants. And I think as a postdoc or an early career assistant professor, it can be helpful to go after smaller grants as well, foundation grants and so on, just to kind of get some money to do your work and demonstrate your success, and then parlay that into a larger federal grant.
Yeah, I'll add that NSF, USDA, DOE, they all have special programs specifically for whatever stage you're at. So if you're a postdoc, there's postdoc awards. I know there are in NIH as well, but that's not really my expertise. So apply for where you are. Don't go after the $10 million thing as a postdoc, obviously. So that's one thing that I would say. Another thing that I would say is that, and this is maybe a little convoluted, but I think it can be interesting to take your area of expertise and try to be creative about how it's applied. You can't go too far with that, and it doesn't always work very well at NIH. I think NIH, you have to be a little bit more squarely in the arena of what the study section is in. But I think for NSF, USDA, and DOE, you can definitely get away with creativity points in bringing one approach into a new field or merging together things that haven't been merged together before. And at the end of the day, that is one strategy for how to be an effective faculty, because you're going to have to be, again, the unique you. And one way of doing that is to combine things that are a little bit different. So I'll give you an example. We just heard that we're getting recommended for a $2 million award in the area of microplastic removal. I've never done anything like that before, but I did something related that I thought could apply, and I pulled the right team together, and the folks reading it were like, wow, that's really interesting. You're using natural organisms, muscles, you know, emulating nature to deal with this engineering problem. That's really interesting. They hadn't heard it before. And so that kind of gave us points, because we figured out a way to take our core wheelhouse skill set and dump it into a slightly different field. And the reviewers in that field are like, wow, cool, I've never heard of that before. And that can kind of be a trick for how to be successful. But, you know, you have to have the right collaborators to make that work and not look like you don't know what you're talking about. But that's also a strategy for how to be successful. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. Any follow-ups from our panelists? Okay, so I just want to follow up from something Amy had mentioned about you don't know who's reviewing your awards. So just one thing to mention, we have a postdoc seed award at UConn that runs every year. So for some of you postdocs that are new, we encourage you to apply for this. The panel is made up from faculty and as expert staff members, but obviously we don't have a faculty member in every single field area. So the person reviewing is looking at how understandable your application is and how the language that's used is able to be understood by an intelligent and a trained, but not necessarily trained in your field area expertise. And so I imagine, sort of taking into account who your audience is, who's reviewing it, is a really vital part of how you pitch that. But a good start is, why not try with our Postdoc Seed Award for next year's cycle? Because it's a much smaller pool of folks that are applying to it, and we will give you feedback on what you submit. So that's a great starting place with that. So that's just a little pitch from the graduate school in terms of that. The next question on our list, how did you find grants and what was your strategy? Who'd like to take that one first?
Well, I'll jump in here. So at least half of the grants I've gotten in my career, I learned about them by a colleague saying, hey, you really should apply for this. And I spend a fair amount of my time trolling through the lists and so forth. And if I see something I think a colleague would be really great at, I send it to them and say, hey, have you ever thought of applying for this? Especially when it's engineers that never went to USDA before, or maybe a information scientist that never went to NIH before, that kind of thing. They might not be looking in that particular area. And so I have a very generous approach towards collaboration. I don't treat it as competition whatsoever, because nobody's exactly you. It's my particular strategy. So I spend a fair amount of time suggesting to others what they could do, and I find that they return the favor more often than not. And so a couple of times I've gotten out of the blue an email from somebody I haven't talked to in a year, and they're like, hey, have you seen this RFI? And lo and behold, it's something I hadn't thought of, and it turns out to be a good fit, and it's catching the wave, right place, right time. And I wouldn't have known about it if it weren't for this, distributed network of other people that are also looking all the time.
Yeah, that I'm an old timer. So when I first started being a faculty member, the necessity of having reasonable grant support was pretty minor. It wasn't a big part of the portfolio of things you had to do to get tenure or to get a job even nowadays. But that's certainly been changing. But I think there's generally, most granting agencies have, at least NSF has, two kinds of programs. One are core programs that continue year after year after year after year. And there, I think you don't have to hear about the proposals. You simply have to know the nature of the program and make sure the kinds of project that you're interested in fits clearly within that program's domain. And if you're not certain, call the program director. They are available, and their job is to talk to you. But when you talk to them, make sure you have some idea of what it is you'd like to propose. And you're simply not asking them questions that are already found in solicitations or in descriptions of the program. Then the second kind of programs are programs that are sort of emerging programs that may only be lasting for 4 years or 8 years or some limited amount of time. And again, so there are particular agencies that support research like that, which you do, whether it's basic, like in the cases of NIH and NSF, or applied, like in the case of USDA or EPA. Make a point of perusing their web pages and the information that they provide that tell you about emerging opportunities, whether it's a new program that's being developed for 4 years, or often at NSF, they have things called Dear Colleague letters, which actually tell you the kinds of new research that they're interested in hearing about. And again, never be afraid to call a program officer, as long as you have, I think, a thoughtful suite of questions that don't duplicate information that you can easily find on the foundation webpage or in other documents.
To address the question that came up in the chat, in your roles right now, a great starting point is your mentor as well. So expressing your interest to your mentor about getting more involved in grant writing, because they may know of opportunities to share with you. Oftentimes, I live in the NIH world, and so there are different ancillary study mechanisms and sometimes supplements that are out there that have a dedicated pool of money set aside. And sometimes more seasoned investigators don't always think of those because they're not really eligible themselves. And so if you express interest in wanting to grow your own grant writing skills, they may have some ideas to share with you as well.
And I'll just add a couple more comments. I would just want to underscore something that Leslie said earlier, and that is I cannot underestimate the importance of being a good colleague. The more that you are a reliable, creative, effective researcher, the more opportunities you'll get because people will approach you and ask you to collaborate with them. So I think sometimes there's this message that gets transmitted as to doctoral students that this is an independent, individualized profession, and it is somewhat. I mean, you are the person, you're going to get tenure down the road, but at the same time, it really, your success will depend on your opportunities to collaborate and partner with other people. So the more that you can demonstrate that you're a good colleague and collaborator, the more opportunities you'll have. I think the other piece I would say is I, as an early career researcher, I found it really useful to identify 2 or 3 researchers out in the field who were maybe 3 or 4 years ahead of me, and to look at the grants that they had pursued and received, and also to look at the activities more broadly that they were doing, and somewhat mimic them. Just to, because they were being successful. If I followed that path, I might also be successful. So I did spend a fair amount of time as a junior faculty member looking at other people's CVs to see what grants they had pursued and received, as well as where they were publishing and other things. I think the other thing I'll just say, and I know this session is on grant writing, but I think it's really important to know your field and what are the expectations for tenure and promotion. So Michael made a comment that grants weren't really expected when he started out as a researcher. So I think you need to look at your field and what's expected for tenure in your university. And when I started out as a junior faculty member at UConn, we weren't necessarily expected to get large grants before tenure. And grant writing is really time intensive. So as a junior scholar, I spent more time publishing than I did grant writing. And then that's shifted as I got tenure, as I have been promoted. And so I think just know what you need to do to secure your job, and factor grant writing into it, but don't, in my field of education, people will not get tenure if all they do is write grants. They have to publish as well. So, really don't get obsessed with grants unless that your field and your institution are going to reward you for that at the cost of not publishing. All right, so know what's expected to you is the bottom line, I would say.
Thanks, Morgan. And that leads us sort of touches upon the next question as well. So I'd like to, hear from other folks a little bit on this regard. Is what types of grants should postdocs be looking for now as they start a faculty position versus as they approach, tenure review? I suppose we touched on it a little bit, but I'm wondering if folks have other thoughts to add to
that. Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for this one. The best type of grant is the grant you can get that's going to support your work. So, I'm not a grant snob. If it's a foundation, that's great. If it's NIH, I think this message of sort of knowing your audience and what's expected of you is really important. So if there's an expectation that you have NIH funding by a certain point in your position, that's really good to know, so you can plan appropriately. But it does make sense for whatever agency you're working with. At least I'll speak from the NIH perspective again. There are some more developmental type of grants, like an R03 mechanism or R21, which are these smaller pilot types of grants that are equally competitive, but are a common pathway to some of these larger grants, as are K awards, which is a career development award. So I don't know if I really answered the question, but there are options out there.
Yeah, I think another thing that's important is that it clearly, I think almost any institution is looking for success in terms of grants personship, but I think they're also interested in active solicitation. So I think it goes back to this, I don't wait till it's perfect to submit a proposal for someone to review, but I think submitting a proposal, even if it's not funded, is an important aspect of your professional development. So I would to think about that sooner rather than later. I think having those frank conversations with your current postdoc supervisor is really important. That person hopefully will be your mentor and your friend and your collaborator for life. And having these kinds of conversations early will be helpful, both in terms of collaborating with them in the short term, but they may have suggestions of people that you might collaborate with on other kinds of projects. The other thing, and that sort of leads me to the next point, is clearly, there still is this, I think academia and everybody sort of values the idea that you're the leader of some intellectual endeavor. But often it's equally important to be, before you perhaps can get to that stage, to associate yourself with established leaders in the field so that you can learn from them, co-PI, or even just a senior personnel. And I say just, I shouldn't have said just, or as a senior personnel, an affiliate with a project, you can move forward. That helps deepen your collaborations, get you involved in the grantsmanship activities. And I think somebody else earlier, a couple of people said, I think a mixed strategy of large and small grants, of NGOs, the private sector business, explore all opportunities. A little bit of success can go a long way to catalyzing you to subsequent successes and more standard kinds of approaches that you hear about in academia, at least.
Just to build on that, just for norm studying in the psychology department here at UConn, for your first 2 years as an assistant professor, you get merit just for submitting applications, not whether the award was funded, but just for making the attempt. So that is really important. And also, I was jumping right to external grants, but internal grants, back to Stuart's point, are also really important. So whatever internal mechanisms are out there, make sure you're looking at those as well.
I just wanted to quickly add, I'm sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Oh,
Well,
so,
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say that the other reason the internal grants can be really important is they provide preliminary data that can inform proposals. You can have great ideas, but without preliminary data to show the feasibility or the number of replicates that you need to do a particular experiment, it can mean the difference between highly rated and unfunded and funded. So those internal grants can play a critical role in catalyzing your success elsewhere.
Yeah, and we talked about grants, but there's a continuum from grant to award. There's some things you can apply for that come with a check. So I applied for a DuPont award. It wasn't really a grant. It was like a 2-pager, and it came with money, and it's an award. So, okay, what is that exactly? And then Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation thing was, I think, a 1-pager, maybe 2, came with money as well, but that's considered more of a grant. But there's a whole continuum of grants and awards, especially for people that are just starting their tenure pathway. Early stage investigators, early career awards, and the mother of them all is the career. It's an acronym, capital CAREER from NSF. It's super important in engineering. I didn't get one, but I don't know, more than a third of our faculty at UConn have them as assistant professors, and there's a huge amount of emphasis placed on that. You get 3 tries, and it has to be while you're an assistant professor, and it's a big, big deal to get the career award. So a lot of assistant professors are planning a strategy during their pre-tenure period about the career award specifically. So as you're applying for jobs as a faculty, you're going to be asked about grant writing. And I think sometimes your strategy for how you're going to apply for grants is almost as important as actually applying for them. It's a really strong signal. Mike Willig is somebody that helped to hire me when I came here 11 years ago. And Mike asked me, what's going to be the title of the first grant you write when you're here at UConn? And I think I managed to make up some convincing baloney, but I was blown away by that question. But that's a great question to prepare for as you're applying for a job, because they want to know, are you going to be able to be successful in funding your program? Do you know the programs? Do you know the program officers? If you're planning to go for, CBET, whatever, okay, who's the current head of that particular part of NSF? What are they looking for? And then as soon as possible, get on a proposal committee. It's much harder for NIH. Being in a study section is for much more senior people generally, but for NSF, as soon as you're an assistant professor puppy, they will definitely put you on 3 different panels if you want to be on them, and you'll learn a ton being on the panels.
Brilliant. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts on that question. And for postdocs who are submitted questions, if you can send them to the host, it just makes it easier for us to then collate those questions for the question and answer section. That will make it easier. One thing I wanted to add here, and now we've sort of reached a sort of middle point of where we are in our session today, just to tailor off some of the ideas of finding grants and applying for as many grants. And even if you don't get those grants, being able to show that you've applied for those grants being important. We have our session on Thursday this week, and it's a 2-parter. Starting from 11 o'clock till 12, we have Valerie Banfi, who's the Citation Manager and Grant Funding Science Librarian, who'll be showing you how to use the UConn's paid software databases to search for grants that you may not even know about, and even some of your faculty members may not be aware about. So, having a multi-pronged approach, talking to faculty members, talking to friends and colleagues to find out what grants are around. But we actually have a data management suite, software suite, where you can actually dig down into government, non-government, internal, external awards. And so she's going to lead you through how to actually do that and how to log in and how to do all of that kind of that part of it. And that's followed by Kay Gruder from the Center for Career Development, who'll actually be talking about how to tailor your CVs, given that you often have to submit a CV with a grant application. How do you want to tailor that CV that will be different from if you're applying for a job, for example? So just want to pitch that, put that in your calendars for now, and save that's Thursday, 11 till 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. And then we follow up that next week with the provost, our new provost, Carl Eshway, is joining us to talk about the PTR process, the promotion, tenure, and review process, and about some of his experience of working with junior faculty and talking about grants, talking about awards, talking about publications. So that'll be another great place to have some questions that you have follow up from here. You might want to bring and pose to Carl, who's been on many, many, many different grants of all different types of sizes. So that's another thing to put down in the calendar. But returning to our session here today, another question we have is, and a lot of this has probably already been addressed, but it'll be interesting to see if you've got anything to add to this. What do you wish you would have known back when you were a postdoc or junior faculty member? What do you wish you would have known back when you were a postdoc or faculty member, junior faculty member?
I mean, I really wish I had known some of the advice that was shared earlier, which is don't wait until something's perfect to submit it. Try earlier. Because I think I waited until I felt really comfortable and really confident. And I probably should have tried, 2 or 3 years earlier for a larger grant. But so I think I wished I had known that. I think I also wish I had known the impact of a postdoctoral fellowship within my field. So I think to Leslie's point about the career, each field has sort of postdocs that once you get them, and this is not a postdoc like you're in at UConn, but a grant for postdocs that kind of opens up a network for you. And I wish I had known there's one in our field in education through the National Academy of Education that I ended up getting. But it opened up a lot of opportunities, and I wish I had applied for it earlier. So I think do the research on your field to know what these opportunities are and just go for them.
2 points, and that's something that I think after I read your proposal, the naive reader needs to be convinced that if funded, your project will lead to more than incremental change. With an 8% funding rate, for example, for let's say 10% in general across a lot of federal institutions. I mean, it's distinguishing the A++s from the A's. And so in terms of the wisdom of a federal agency or any agency investing in you, giving you $100,000 or $1 million, I think agencies will wish to see that you're more than just gradually increasing the body of knowledge and understanding we have, but are making a big contribution to that. So I think that that's really important. And the other thing is, at least at NSF, you have this balance, as we talked about earlier, between communicating with the generalist in your field to the specialist in a particular area of your research. I mean, ultimately, to be successful in most NSF panels, essentially, you have to secure one person as your advocate. The power of a single person on a panel is tremendous. And so that's a hard thing to figure out how to do. And I don't know if I have the answer to that. But I think it's really important that your proposal is written in such probably a person who is close to or in your field will feel that they can be the advocate for this, because in fact it will more than incrementally increase the knowledge associated with your field. So that's sort of the trick, I think, that's partly important in writing proposals. When you write papers, they often are incremental improvements in our knowledge or understanding, and that's great. And that, for the most part, perhaps is the way that science moves forward. But I think funding agencies try to get a little bit more bang for their buck.
I would add a couple of practical things. I wish I would have embraced a better reference manager software very early in my career, and started creating a library of articles that I still cite today. I wasted a lot of time on references. That seems trivial, but it actually adds up in the end. And along with that, I wish I had developed a better system for tracking versions of grants. You often end up going back to something you had written earlier, and so just having a really good management system on that end of things. And I wish, I don't know how this would have happened, but I would have had a better appreciation for time and just how long some things take, and had the wisdom to say no to some opportunities so that I saved more time for the opportunities I felt most passionate about. And I think that's a lesson that comes as you move through your career. It gets a little easier to say no to things that are a little bit more tangential or not really exciting you as much as what you want to be working on. And it's really hard to do that when you're a postdoc or junior faculty member and are just eager for opportunities. But I would encourage you to feel like you have that ability to focus on sort of what's most meaningful to you, while at the same time saying yes to enough opportunities that you're starting to form collaborations. So that's a pretty wishy-washy answer, but it's the truth. And I don't know how to strike that balance. I think it's just an ongoing process to figure that out.
So one thing I wish I had known, I've always been maybe naively enthusiastic about my science, making it exciting and out there and big and crazy enough has never been my problem. My problem has been the devil's in the details a little bit. And I didn't really understand why my reviewers kept saying that it was a bit vague or a bit unclear exactly what I was doing until I started looking at funded NIH proposals. And I was like, oh, okay, where every single detail is spelled out in such clear specificity. And so that actually helped me recalibrate the level of detail is needed. Every different agency has kind of different standards. So writing an NIH grant is very different from writing an NSF grant. And I'll be frank, I've never been successful with NIH. In fact, across the entire School of Engineering, as a faculty, all 150 people, our group success rate at NIH is 3%, which is the lowest success rate by far of any of the agencies. So it underlies the point of know your agency, know your audience, know who you're writing for. I think looking at some successful awards is really important. Serving on some panels is really important. But when you get those reviews, it can be hard. You've probably been really successful in your career so far. You've done great things. You've gotten into the schools you've applied to. You've gotten your papers published. And then, like many of us, you're going to go 0 for 10 on your first 10 of grants. That's a very common experience, and it can be very hard. And you get these reviews and they say it was vague, or, this is wrong. You'll get mad at those reviewers and you'll think that they're wrong, but, the customer's always right. And so if they're thinking that it's vague, or if they're thinking that whatever your particular issue is, you have to embrace that. And it took me years to realize that actually they're right. And I wasn't being specific enough about exactly how I was doing the work. So I would say, read that solicitation really carefully. Don't read it for what you hope it says, read it for what it actually says, and talk to the program official about that solicitation. And then if you should be unsuccessful, read those reviews and then let it sit and then read them again when you can be rational and calm about it and try to learn from them. Because just like doing science, when everything works perfectly, we're not learning anything. But it's actually the kind of the failures, the experiments that fail, the proposals that fail, that teach us the most. So it's hard, but you know, we've all been there. And maybe hearing some of the hard stories from some of the older folks can help that be a little easier to take, getting those rejections coming down.
You're muted, Michael. I can unmute you. I'll unmute you.
One of the things that people may not know, often the reviewers of a proposal, let's say in 1999, a subset of the reviewers will do it in 2000. And so if you fail to address the critiques from earlier reviews, that often can be doubly bad. One, because you haven't improved the quality of proposal, but two, there are likely to be people on that proposal review that will have read the previous version, that will have known they have given critiques, and will see the absence of a response as not only arrogant, but sort of a failure to really appreciate an improvement in your science. So I think it's really important that you consider those critiques very seriously and incorporate a response to them in the proposals. And at NSF, at least, you have the opportunity in a resubmitted proposal to say responses to previous reviews. Now, it counts as part of your page limit, but just taking a paragraph or a half a page to talk about how substantively you may have changed the proposal, or even explain why you didn't change it in a particular way, could be a key note that will change the opinion of a reviewer. So I encourage you to, as Leslie was saying, to take those critiques to heart and really use them effectively in your revisions.
So it seems that a central feature to a lot of these responses have been the notion of needing to keep a track of your critiques and then revising, resubmitting. So a question that comes to mind for me is, so how do you folks keep track of your systems? What do you use to keep track of all of the different versions of your of the awards, and at what stages? Do you have a particular software management system you use? Do you use Google Docs? Do you use a Word document? Are there do's and don'ts for you that's important in terms of managing the logistics of applying for awards?
Well, I would echo what Amy said. Managing your references is crucial. I hear from everyone that Mendeley is the way to go. So if you haven't chosen a language yet, maybe consider Mendeley. I was an EndNote person, and I need to retool. In terms of the versioning, when I'm running the show, I would do it in Word, but that quickly breaks down when you have a large group that's working on the same proposal. I actually lost an opportunity to get a big award recently in the last couple of years because of a snafu on the wrong version went around for final edits, and we basically missed a deadline. So it has to be, you got to think about that in advance. And I've done Google Docs, and I've done SharePoint, the Yukon kind of software. I've done all kinds of different things, but early on when you talk as a team, that's actually something that you talk about, and you assign roles and you assign procedures about how you're going to share documents, how you're going to deal with versioning, how you're going to deal with figures. I mean, this is a little bit down in the weeds, but I do use Word, and whoever's in charge of the document essentially is probably going to have to embed all the citations and reinsert all the figures at the end. So you need to spare half a day to do that at the end once the text has been edited. So what I find works best is put the text up somewhere like Google Docs where everybody can continuously share, and you don't have multiple versions diverging and half your team is editing this version and half the team's editing that version. That happens all the time. So you can't have that. So something like Google Docs, but Google Docs can't manage the pagination and the figures and all of that stuff as well as it needs to yet. So you kind of have to pull it down off the cloud and then locally do the final polishing before the deadline. So
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just say it always takes longer than you think. And you're also going to be dealing with your, Office of Sponsored Projects. So there's another layer of review, et cetera. So I would just say, try to get the final version of the text done really early, and have a point person. And so in the most recent grant I submitted, I was the person who was guarding the document and making sure there wasn't any confusion about what was going in. And if people were editing a section, they would just edit that section, cut it out, edit it, and send me that section back, and I would put it in the document. Because there's nothing worse, like Leslie, I feel for you, there's nothing worse than having that happen, and you can't afford to have it happen at the end.
I had a colleague once also looking at keeping an eye on what's going on. They left off the time zone for the submission deadline, and they didn't realize that the actual time was in a different time zone, which had already passed by the time they came to submit. So they also lost out on the grant because they didn't keep a track of that. So sounds like managing these things is a really important part of the skill set to develop. Next question, from a strategic perspective, how do you balance involvement in disciplinary versus multi or transdisciplinary projects?
My personal take, and again, I think this doesn't work at NIH, which is why I have, over 5 at NIH, so just bear that in mind if that's your field. I think for NSF, what works is the bit more out there, the better. You've got to convince them that something will get done and it will lead to advancement, but the more you can broaden the disciplines and combine disciplines together in a creative way, slapping this thing from this field with this thing from that field, I think it's been a successful strategy for getting stuff to fly. But it's like a T almost, the breadth of disciplines I think is great, but at the end of the day, you've got to have depth as well. You've got to really not be just scratching the surface on whatever theory and whatever experimental tools or strategies you're bringing to bear. You need to be current on the latest capabilities in the field, and you need to go deep enough that you're convincing them that you're not just faking it.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. I would also say that none of the grant, and again, NIH world, but none of the grant mechanisms that are out there that I'm familiar with now are monodisciplinary. Everything is moving in an interdisciplinary direction. And so with NIH, even if your idea isn't sort of as novel as Leslie's talking about and these merging of these big fields, they still expect your team to have expertise in all of the different areas touched on. So for example, weight management, that involves eating, exercise. There's obviously some statistical component to, analyzing the trials. So they're going to be looking to see, do you have a health psychologist on there? Do you have a nutritionist? Do you have someone with an exercise background? And who do you have for biostats? So, just by looking at your team composition, it's interdisciplinary. It may not be transdisciplinary and, starting a whole new field, but you're certainly expected to have collaborators from the different disciplines who are going to need to have that depth of expertise in each of those areas. So, and I mean, maybe someone else feels differently, but to me, all of science is sort of moving in this direction where it's expected that you're going to be making connections to other fields.
So I would sort of pose the question slightly differently, and I would say, what is the question that you're trying to answer? Then assembly the team, whether that's you alone or you and others, that best allows you to, with sufficient depth and breadth, answer the question with some high degree of confidence. Some questions I think are inherently more disciplinary than others. Other kinds of questions are multidisciplinary, and some are actually transdisciplinary. There were new disciplines are emerging at the confluence of others. But I think that ultimately what you do is you assemble the team with the expertise and the capability that allow you to answer the question or the suite of questions that you're proposing to the agency. And that will lead you to either more disciplinary proposals or more multidisciplinary proposals. And by the way, sometimes you could submit a multidisciplinary proposal that has failed, but you can carve out of that a more disciplinary focus that's part of it that you might be able to submit to the same institution or same foundation or a different foundation. So I think you have multiple alternatives for how you can sort of play this game of balancing disciplinary and multidisciplinary.
There's a question in the chat on how to create effective teams for grant applications. So I think one thing is somebody coming straight out of your PhD and then your postdoc, you hopefully have a cool tool that the old folks in the field are excited to try out. So that's one thing that you've got. So if you're, been working on artificial intelligence, everyone's going to want to talk to you. And if you don't kind of have that niche, that trick, that thing, think about maybe what that could be, some capability, whether it's like, I don't know, electron microscopy or some kind of genomics tool or some kind of a thing that you're offering. And then you can approach somebody that maybe hasn't applied that particular tool yet in their work and say, hey, you're the world expert in, whatever this area is. I think my tool could really be used effectively in this field, and let's write a proposal together. And I think that would be a winning strategy for getting somebody big in the field to collaborate with you if you're bringing something kind of unique that they haven't had a chance to play with yet, especially if you're have the vision to see what the emerging things are. And don't be afraid to talk with people and say, hey, where do you think the field is headed? I got my dissertation work done in bioremediation. Do you know how many grants there are now in bioremediation? Zippo. So it was kind of a plateauing field. And so in my postdoc, I kind of was aware of that, not because I'm so brilliant or anything, but because people I respected and trusted kind of warned me like, hey, I rode that train through tenure and promotion. I'm not sure it's going to be there for 20 years for you. You probably need to find an emerging area and be there for that. So that's something to think about as well. In terms of specifically finding collaborators, there's a balance. As Amy says, sometimes you say yes to projects you should say no to. And as an assistant professor, you need to guard yourself from being too fractured and diluted in too many different areas. But at the same time, I think you have to send darts in multiple directions because it's tough to get funded, it's tough to stay funded, and you have to be agile so that you're in the right place at the right time. Part of it's skill, part of it's hard work, part of it's luck, and part of it's just having enough attempts out there, enough at-bats so that you increase your chances of getting lucky, right? So you're going to increase your odds if you just have more different things, more rods in the fire. So what I did when I first came to UConn is I had coffee with a bunch of different people, and some people I asked to have coffee with me kind of put me off and didn't have time, and that's great. And some people did, and it never went anywhere. But one of the people that I had coffee with, I've written virtually every grant with him since then, and he's a microbiologist that gives me credibility in that area. And he's not afraid to talk to an engineer about some wacky new areas. And we've been able to apply that in a bunch of different ways. It's a really winning team. So you have to balance keeping your eye on the ball and knowing what your focus is with broadening too much. And that's always going to be a tension in the field, but you can't be afraid to have a few coffees a week. If you think about it, an hour a week, meeting 2 new people, you never know where that's going to lead. Think twice and 3 times before you say yes to writing the grants, but it's definitely worth having the coffee and meeting the people and having that conversation.
One thing that I totally echo that. One thing I think you have to be careful about is that we emphasized in the beginning, be a good collaborator, but also you want to make sure you're collaborating with people who are good collaborators. So I'm not exactly sure. I'd be interested in hearing what you did, Leslie, to make sure that these people, you're meeting a lot of people. How did you know who you wanted to pair up with? Because I think for me, I kind of look for collaborators and then I do some homework on those potential collaborators, so try to get a sense of, are they reliable? I can see the quality of their work, that's public, but those more interpersonal and work ethic questions are that information is less easily gathered. And so I ended up talking to a lot of people behind the scenes about people, and just to kind of get a sense of, okay, who might I want to join up with, and who could I put together a really solid project with as well, but not, but also have it be a pleasant working relationship, because that's really important. So Leslie, what did you do to kind of vet those people?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I just, in that sense, got lucky. It's gonna sound like I'm sucking up to Mike Willig here a little bit more, but at the time there was a 1 semester graduate funding mechanism through CEASE, the center that Mike was running at the time, and so there was a way to test that collaboration that was really low cost. You didn't have to write the whole grant and do the whole project to see if they were a good collaborator. You could just collaborate for 1 semester, share 1 student, do some preliminary stuff, and that's actually what we ended up doing. So it wasn't a huge investment. You know, it was a way to fund a student for a semester and to see where it went. And so that gets back to these internal funding opportunities, seed funding, and other mechanisms like that, which can be really important, not just for getting preliminary data, but also for test driving some collaborations as well and seeing where it goes. And yeah, I have started other collaborations that never went anywhere. But when I found out I worked really well with this particular collaborator of mine here at UConn, you know, I've done everything I can to share credit. You know, whenever somebody tries to write an article and doesn't include his name, I'm like, stop the presses. You know, this is a partnership, share the credit, share the authorship, share the alternate who's the head PI, alternate who's the senior writer, alternate who's the lead on the patents, and just really be very careful about sharing credit so that nobody feels like their contributions are not valued, and hang on to those good collaborators with both hands, and look for ways that are low cost to test the collaboration. I think for some good strategies.
Thank you, folks, for some really interesting insights. Sorry, Amy, did you have something more to add?
Well, I was just going to chime in that this is kind of an individual process as well. So I'm thinking about some of the collaborators I had, one who's at UConn who's now retired, people said, oh, don't ever work with that person. They're so difficult. They're so mean, blah, blah, blah. And for me, the partnership worked. You know, I respected the person's expertise. It took us a little while, but we got to have a good working relationship. So you can't always just go on what other people are saying about someone's reputation. On the flip side, if it's a consistent message about this person does not value collaboration or, junior colleagues, that's important to listen to. But I do think it's trial and error to some extent, and finding those opportunities to collaborate in a situation where it's not a long-term commitment are really important. And I also just wanted to put in a plug for our centers and institutes. Like, oftentimes these are places you can go if you're looking for a collaborator who has expertise in an area outside your own. So maybe your mentor doesn't know, or people in your department don't really know who to suggest. You can come to INCHIP, for example, and ask, I'm looking for someone with expertise in health economics or whatever the case may be. And we tend to know sort of who's out there and who seems to be willing to collaborate with folks and can make suggestions. So, utilize those existing resources as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to link in some questions here from our chat. And try and broaden this out a bit. This question here is, I'm in the process of writing a grant application for an officer's grant through the WT Grant Foundation. If anyone has experience with this foundation, can you offer any insight on the foundation? And I'll broaden that question a bit more out to, if you haven't worked with the foundation before, like, what would your tips be in terms of finding out the answer to that question? How would you go about it?
Well, obviously, I haven't applied to them.
We can hear you, Michael.
Okay, yeah, something kept beeping. But I guess the first thing I would do again is to very carefully look at the mission statements and description of activities that foundation is interested in, to look at the history of grants that they offered in the past 3 to 4 years, to see the diversity of proposals that they've accepted and funded. And 3, call the program officer at that foundation to discuss the kinds of things you're interested in and the kinds of things they're interested in, to see if there's see if you guys are willing to date initially, at least, to see if a productive marriage can be the outcome of the opportunity. So it's hard to do, but I think you have to kind of diversify your approaches to understand just like you have to understand your collaborator, you kind of have to understand your funding agency, because in a sense, they're collaborators with you too, because they're interested in funding the kinds of research that you may or may not be interested in doing.
So I have applied for a grant from this foundation. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago, and we did not get the grant. But I would echo a lot of the things that Mike said about reaching out to a program officer. I would also look at the grants that they've recently funded in the last year or two to see, can you discern some sort of trajectory or emphasis that they're moving on to. But I wouldn't, then discount myself if my focus were a little bit different, because who knows, maybe they're changing focus, or maybe they want to fund in a slightly different area. I would read the call or the grant parameters really, really closely and follow them as carefully as possible. And then as an early career researcher, I would definitely reach out to ask whether there are particular supports for first-time applicants, that sort of thing. And then just give it your best shot. I would those are the steps I would take.
Thank you. Another follow-up question here. Any recommendations for resources to strengthen my grant writing in general? My areas of expertise are in human rights, education, and youth activism.
What was the end of that, Stuart? I didn't hear it.
Human rights, education, and youth activism is this postdoc's expertise area. Sorry, you're muted, Michael.
I would guess, but I'd be wrong, that this particular postdoc is affiliated with a faculty member in the Human Rights Institute. But if they are not, and even if they are, I would encourage them to seek advice from members of that institute to fully explore the space of collaborators and ideas that are emerging in that discipline, and go from there.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with writing grants with more senior people to start out with. The first bunch of grants I wrote, I was kind of salty about it at the time, but when I was really new at it, my advisors were kind of, it was to fund me to continue to be a postdoc, but I wasn't a PI or a co-PI on it. Now, I don't know if that is kosher in every field or how that worked, and I felt like I was ghostwriting grants for more senior people, all of whom happen to be white men, of course, but it actually taught me quite a lot. And then, it was the arrangement so that they were supporting me on a postdoc. I spent some of my postdoc time writing additional grants as well as doing research and publishing, but it was really valuable training. And even though my name wasn't on the top line, that's fair, because they still were doing quite a lot of the work, the writing, the mentoring, that took the crap that I gave them and turned it into something much more reasonable. And it was like an apprenticeship in grant writing in a way, So kind of like the first attempt at a paper you probably tried to write was not going to fly right away either. So you have to crawl before you can walk and walk before you can run. And so I think that's completely fair, as well as starting for much smaller things, more local things, even if it's a tiny internal grant or some small foundation, winning it will definitely build confidence and help you grow towards other things. There are also, I don't know of anything like this in this particular field, but I have been part of writing workshops in different fields that are out there. You can sometimes get your sponsors to help pay for that, or you can register for it yourself. But I've gone away on some like rustic week-long retreats. I've done some things for women in science and other stuff like that, where you just work on writing with a group of other people, and they bring in a guru a little bit, but it's also partly just peer work. So look out for summer writing workshops that can also help you in this particular area.
And I would also, and I think, again, this is where your mentors can come in, and also looking at CVs can come in, identify the funding sources for people who have expertise like you do. So when you said what your funding, your expertise is or your areas are, it made me think of the Spencer Foundation, which is a relatively small foundation, but does a lot of funding in education and is very well regarded. To get a grant from the Spencer Foundation is huge in education. So, just knowing that kind of thing, where to look is really important. And so I would ask your mentors and go in each of those fields. Go in human rights, go to education. I'm happy to talk with you, whoever you are, or other people who are in the education school who might be doing research in a related area, and ask them, where should I start looking, and what is your advice for pursuing grants to get me started?
Thank you. Appreciate all those thoughts and responses. And we're always looking to partner with other faculty in other departments to help, especially in the humanities as well, in terms of looking at grant writing, where grants are very much available in humanities, but it's not so much your bread and butter in the majority of the areas as it would be if you were in some of the hard sciences, social sciences, health sciences, for example. Next question I posted in the chat for panelists so they can read it. It's a bit of a longer one. I'm going to read it out here and I'll post it for our postdocs. I'm a little confused about the distinction between PI and co-PI. My publication track record is weak, and so the program officer suggested that I be listed as a co-PI with a senior person listed as PI, and then when the grant is awarded, I could be revised to be the PI. I thought that the co-PI and the PI are in the same in regards to credit, and the only difference was that the PI is the one who's actually submitting the paperwork. Can you comment on how the co-PI versus PI is evaluated on CVs in regards to credit and prestige?
That's so sweet. We're all the same. We're all just collaborating. Yeah, no, I don't think that's true. Certainly not in every field. So a very generous, creative suggestion, I think, by the program officer to revise it. It absolutely is possible to change around who's PI and who's co-PI. And the panelists are more likely to be snotty or whatever about, looking at credit and track record. But PI is different. PI is more like senior author. It's virtually always a more experienced, older, more established person in the field. And the co-PIs are sort of have a smaller amount of credit and a smaller amount of responsibility, if not a smaller amount of work. So that person may be kind of the coordinator, the person that runs the show, the organizer, and then individual co-PIs might have smaller areas of responsibility for the grants.
Yeah, and within NIH, there's no longer a co-PI distinction, or a role, I should say. And so you're either the PI or you're a multiple PI, which means you share jointly that credit, or you're a co-investigator. And so I don't know which grant mechanism you're considering, but NIH would be a multiple PI situation, which in that case, typically you do get equal credit on CVs for MPI, but that really means you're splitting responsibility for the overall scientific management and oversight of the grant, compared to a co-I, which, as Leslie was saying, a lower level of commitment and credit.
Yeah, at NSF, in fact, there can only be 5 PI or co-PIs. There can only be 1 PI, and the other 4 can be co-PIs. Anything beyond that are senior personnel. But in the olden days, I might have said that I thought that program officer's response was a bit disingenuous, because if you're the intellectual leader of the project, I felt my immediate reaction to is, oh, that doesn't seem right to me. And I think I'd say that perhaps that still has an element of truth to it. But I think that there's 2 other aspects of being the PI that's really important. And that is there needs to be one person that manages the project, juggles all the parts, makes sure everything is on time, make sure the people who are doing parts come together to synthesize the work. And so there's the managerial part of it, which of course, often more senior personnel are more adept than, let's say, more junior personnel, only because of experience, not because of innate capacity, but because of experience. And the third one is there's financial responsibility also above and beyond the sort of the scientific management of the program. And so the PI has all three of those responsibilities: the intellectual leadership, the managerial part, and the financial leadership. And so I think in cases where it's particularly a large or complex grant, having a more senior person that has contributed significantly intellectually to the project, I mean, not only there because of managerial or financial savvy, could be a reasonable strategy to use moving forward. I think with projects that are less ambitious in scope or more restricted in size, I think that the intellectual component becomes the dominant feature. But it is an interesting question, and there's no right answer to it. But I think that it's a balance of those three things. And of course, in a mercenary kind of way, an excellent proposal that's not funded doesn't get you very far. So at some level, we have to be practical, and sometimes we have to sort of suck it up a little bit. And even though we always know our contributions more than we know other people's contributions. That's the nature of information. So, without going too far in the deep end, I think that sometimes making that sacrifice to be a co-PI, if indeed you don't have the managerial and financial responsibility, is a wise decision if that other person is willing and able to do so. But it's a balance.
I want to throw out two things from my experience. One, having served on panels and review organizations, including for Department of Energy, I was part of the panels that looked at the bioenergy research centers. These are $125 million centers. And so there was a lot of consideration for the managerial expertise of the people that were sort of in charge of the overall 125 million, as well as the big chunks of it. And sometimes it came out that, oh, well, this person's largest grant before this is X, and this would be 5 times larger. That's too big of a jump. So they might give you a grant of a few $100,000 as a first-time investigator, but you're not going to get a multi-million-dollar grant as a first-time investigator. It's not going to happen. And you're probably not going to jump from 200,000 to 2 million either in one step. So you have to be strategic about that, from exactly what Mike was saying about from a managerial standpoint. Just managing a grant, not easy, a lot of stuff that goes into it. And then even less than that, based on the agency, based on the expertise, you can just sometimes strategically decide within your group, okay, who does it make the most sense to put as the PI? Sometimes it has to be a person from a certain field. So a lot of times NSF has a call that comes out through engineering. You have to have an engineer as the PI, but it can be an interdisciplinary group, or maybe it's another way around. And so from DOE as well, depending on what the type of call is, if it's from their plant sciences group, you would never put an engineer as the PI, because they're not going to fund an engineer as the PI. You're going to want to put somebody from the biological, horticulture, plant science, agronomy area as the first person. So sometimes these decisions are, as Mike said, just very strategic, because getting the grant is the first step.
I wanted to add one other thing real quickly there is that, and I think these kinds of discussions are important early on in the grant writing process. Hopefully you're not doing it on the day of submission or 2 days before the submission, but that's something that you talk about early on so that everybody understands their sort of rights and responsibilities and what their ultimate position will be. So I think having that truthfulness and openness in the collaboration is important from the get-go.
Thanks, folks. For postdocs who joined us a little later in today's session, you can submit your questions via the chat box. Just open it. One of the bubbles beneath has a little sort of speech mark. You can open that up and you can type your message into the chat and send it to host, and then I'll be able to read your question out for you. A couple more questions that we have in. One is, I think, a fairly straightforward question, but one that gets asked quite frequently. And I think it is dependent on the field area you're in, but I'll look to our experts here. Can postdocs apply for grants as PI? Can the one grants be used to acquire a tenure research faculty position in Yukon or elsewhere?
Depends on the mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, at UConn, some research faculty cannot even apply as PI for some grants. So, but if it's a grant that's specifically a PI, a postdoc sponsorship thing, then yes, so it depends on the institution and it depends on the grant mechanism.
Yeah, at NSF, for example, it's entirely up to the university as to whom they will allow to be a senior, the PI, the primary investigator on the project. So if the university will allow you as a postdoc to assume that role, that's fine. If they will not, it really doesn't matter. NSF won't balk at that.
So I take it it's a case-by-case basis. So you've had postdocs that you've worked with that have been able to get PIs, be able to be the PI on an award whilst being here at UConn.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think for folks who are asking that question's come up several times. It's not so much what's on your offer letter as a postdoc. It's what's the decision is with the granting agency and with discussion with the university to make sure that's okay. So it's not a blanket no, but you need to look into it and research into it, I think.
But I think at NSF, it's, I can't speak specifically to the health sciences or education or some other fields, but for CLAS and engineering, it's not going to be a regular grant mechanism. Postdocs are generally not allowed to be the PI. In fact, even research assistant professors are not allowed to be the PI for most of the $100,000, $500,000, $1 million level grants. That is exclusively tenure track faculty that can be the PI of those types of grants. So, because actually one thing you may not realize is that even though it's your intellectual property and you're writing the grant, it's actually the university that applies for the money on your behalf. It's the Office of Sponsored Programs and the Vice President for Research's office is actually applying for the money and receiving the money. So they want that to be a person that has kind of a long-term relationship with the university, not somebody that's here now and is leaving in a few months or whatever. However, if it's a postdoc grant, like a postdoc award specifically, some type of fellowship, that can travel with you. And that's really more something that you will have personally. So I think that's where the big difference lies.
So, for example, postdocs are welcome to apply for our postdoc seed award as the PI, because that's where we want you to have that experience. And as opposed to looking into other areas, you're likely to be a co-PI, or as opposed to the PI. So just to answer that question, folks.
But postdocs cannot apply for the UConn Research Excellence Programs or a lot of the other seed awards. You have to be a tenure track faculty to apply for those.
Great, thank you. Next question, and I don't want to end on this question, so I'd like another postdoc to send us some questions, because this one is I'd like to see it as negative, but a very important part, I think, and that is there a giving up rule? When do you make the decision to not resubmit a proposal after it's been rejected 2 or more times?
I mean, I'll freely admit, I will say I gave up on NIH. I tried and tried and tried with NIH. When I first got here, I spent all my startup money going in a certain direction. My first student went in a certain direction, and I banged my head against the NIH wall, and I never got anywhere. I did not have the clinical, translational, medical collaborator that I needed. I didn't have access to animal models. I didn't have access to real human wounds. At biofilms and bacterial stuff. I got a large UConn internal award in that direction. It never went anywhere, and I eventually diversified my way away from it. I have a colleague who's going up for tenure this year and has been like 0 for 30 at NIH. And just this last year, finally, she took the advice of others to diversify what she's applying for. And everything she applied for this last year has gotten funded, thank God. She'll get tenure, she got a career, but she's been completely unsuccessful at NIH. And I'll let Amy speak to why it is that our engineers don't get anywhere at NIH. But I think it's because you need that real connection with clinical outcomes and patients and how it can't be a theoretical exercise. It can't be, fundamental science that's great for NSF. It's not going to fly for NIH. So eventually, because that's not my training, that's not my expertise, I gave up and walked away, and it's never been funded.
Come back. No, I'm just kidding. I think that may have been true. I see more of a push now to incorporate some more sort of basic science and really have the spectrum from basic to very applied clinical applications included in the same grant mechanism. So back to the original question of when do you give up? I don't know. I mean, I think for me, most of my decisions have been made based on what I think is important to study and what questions I have at the time. And so, sometimes those get repackaged into different applications. Most of my work has sort of followed on a consistent trajectory. I mean, I could find threads that connect most of what I've done. And so it's not really just it's giving up. It's just tackling the question from a different perspective. So I don't know. At NIH, there are, limitations too. I mean, they've loosened up recently about how many times you can resubmit. So they'll just tell you, no, thanks, don't put this in anymore. You got to come up with a whole new grant, although it can still be some of the same ideas repackaged. So I think it should be based more on how you're feeling about the science. Is this still an important question? And you just need to figure out a better way to communicate it to people. Or, are they giving you good advice and you need to, kind of change how you're thinking about this?
And I would just add, I would really look carefully at the reviews and see what is the nature of the objections to the proposal. Do the reviewers have really deep reservations about the methods or the design that you just can't address? So in other words, are you likely to get the same response if you submit it again? Or are the reservations things that you can address through revision? So I think that's one kind of criterion to think about. Another one would be, how excited are you about the research? And do you want to continue to pursue this, or has the field moved? Have your interests moved in a new direction? So I think, I've definitely walked away from proposals when I felt like I couldn't address the concerns, or I wanted to train my efforts in another direction.
And sometimes you can just time a little bit, and it may be that the field needs to catch up to you. So you have to, sometimes you have to take no for no if it's not going to fly. And, there's a lot of reasons you write proposals. Some of them are just to keep the work going. And so that's where diversity can help. And then maybe the ideas that you had percolating underneath the surface before, it'll be the right time to apply them in a new area, or they'll receive a new life. So I don't think anything 100% dies. There's aspects of what I did, the tools I was looking at, the knowledge I have, even in those unsuccessful NIH proposals, that you can still see in some stuff I've done for the Department of Energy. So the learning that you do, the papers you read, the knowledge you have, the creative connections you make are never lost. They're going to find new life in some other work that you do in the future.
I'm going to, for the sake of honesty, I'm going to admit that I submitted that question. And I submitted that question because when I was at NSF, there was a standing, I guess, belief among program officers that if a proposal has gone more than 3 times, it's the walking dead. People are just wasting their time by submitting it a 4th time or a 5th time. And I think that's often the case. And I think that's often the case because people haven't carefully looked at the nature of the reviews. And it's only incrementally changed. It's not substantively changed in response to the reviews. So I think that that's really important. But I wanted to add another thing is one of those proposals that I put up there. In fact, the first one, the Opus proposals, I think I submitted it 5 times before it was funded. And part of the thing that I think ultimately led to success was in fact thinking about how to focus the proposal more on the questions that were highest impact on the field rather than a comprehensive answer of that question in its full amplitude. And the second one is I also had conversations with the program officer. I think that's really an important question, to get their honest assessment, because you can get reviews that are all over the place, right? There are often reviewers that are actually a part of the panel. They review 10 other proposals. They review a proposal in the context of the other 10 they've looked at. Ad hoc reviewers, which get these sort of one at a time, and they're evaluating it truthfully and honestly, but not in the same context as the panelists. And the panelists take part in the discussion of the pros and cons of that proposal in the context of all the other proposals. So not all reviews are equal in the eyes of the program because of the different nature of these ad hoc versus panel reviews. But the program officer should be able to give you some insight into the negative comments that were truly negative and were weighted heavily by the program versus sometimes there's a negative comment, frankly, that's wrong. You know, and a person can just say, this is not true. And in fact, it is true. and hopefully the program recognized that and advised the committee to disregard that comment, but you won't know that when you read the reviews. So it really is important, especially when you've gone through multiple rejections and hopefully multiple revisions, that you have a frank and honest conversation with the program officer of their assessment. In the end, you have to make the decision yourself. There are multiple things you could do: resubmit it, submit it elsewhere, put it aside for a year and think about it 2 years later. But I think that if you can convince yourself truthfully that it's a good idea, that it will make a significant advancement in knowledge in a discipline or in a multidisciplinary area, I think it's worthy of consideration of where you might submit it, leading to success.
Thank you for those thoughts on giving up or taking the next opportunity. Another couple of questions come in. Is there a typical timeline for a successful grant writing process? Depending on the grant amount, how long do you allocate from the idea generation to submission?
Not long enough. Yeah, it seems like some of the recent opportunities have really quick turnaround times that we've been working on. So, 2 months in one case. Usually if I'm working on a grant that I'm spearheading myself, I like to give myself at least 3 or 4 months. We're working on a project right now that's going to be a larger center grant, and we started talking about it a little while ago, and it's not due until September of 2021. But that has a lot, moving pieces and subcontracts and whatnot. So I don't know what the standard recommendation is, but for your first grant, I would think at least 4 to 6 months. I'd be curious what other people have to say about that.
I think it depends on a few different things. One is your level of expertise in the topic. So if you're really comfortable with the topic and the literature in and out, and you can write a lot of the background for the grant just sort of immediately, then I think 3 months or something like that is reasonable. But if you're starting from, and if you're moving into an area that you don't know a whole lot about, I would back it out even more. And I think also if you're working with collaborators you don't know that well at the beginning. I mean, I think I've worked on grants for a year just to make sure that it was as strong as possible, and it was moving into a new area also. So I think it really ranges depending on the grant and on you and on your team.
The most successful ones I've done with big teams, like this $2 million NSF one that we just finished. I was just looking at my calendar a second ago, and we started meeting on it in May 2019 and met on it. There was a letter of intent, and then a pre-proposal, and then a full proposal. And so a group met consistently, I want to say every 1 to 2 weeks for most of a year on that particular project. And so that's at the higher end. I tend to scramble at the last minute. I get a crazy idea and it's due, in 6 weeks, and I'll put it in, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think a year would be great. If you had a year, I'd feel comfortable starting on a new thing. If it's a lot less than that, then it depends. And it also depends on how large it is. If it's a 2 or 3 pager versus a 25 pager, those are obviously very different things.